Hi, today I'm here with R.T. Rybak. Hello. I think a lot of people probably know him very well here in the city. You were first elected as mayor in 2001, I believe, right?
Yes, I was. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Won the primary in this building here on Nicollet.
Yeah,
and
and
was
on
my
9/11
headquarters.
you said.
Yeah, it was a really strange night, as you can imagine. I won a primary. I had never run an election before, so here I finally am realizing my literally childhood dream. And the country was under attack. And what do you say? It was just a very strange night, but it's a great building you're in with good memories for me.
Good, good. So I think you're the only one who's won 3 terms, right? Or
Mayor Fraser won. Mayor Fraser was mayor for, I think, 16 years, maybe. I may be wrong on that, but he's the longest serving mayor.
Okay.
So,
all right. Well, and a lot of people know you now for your current role, which is CEO of the Minneapolis Foundation.
yes. And,
Doing good work there. And so last week I was able to attend the Future in Journalism conference,
great.
which was excellent and I think very relevant to right now. And what spawned the foundation to do that conference now? Was there anything in particular?
Well, the foundation's main role is we're the second oldest community foundation in the country. So Cleveland got this idea about 115 years ago that while there are foundations you have where one group and one board of directors controls it, the Ford Foundation, the McKnight Foundation, or Bush locally. The idea was start a community foundation so that it was really about a permanent piece of the civic infrastructure, that there's always a foundation there that puts out its own money onto what the community needs and is a place where individuals can open up their own charitable account, a donor advised fund. So that's the main thing we do. And by the way, we've grown that a lot from 40 million when I got there to now 120 million out a year. So that's good.
Wow, impressive.
And we also think a large part of what we do is to grow a deeper civic ecosystem. So we brought back something called the Minnesota Meeting, which had been around a while before, to take one big issue each year and put it on the civic agenda. So a year ago it was water and environmental justice. And this year it is how do Minnesotans get their information.
Yeah.
And so we had our Minnesota meeting. We also are partnering with the Westminster Town Hall Forum to bring in different speakers on that same topic. So a couple weeks ago at the Town Hall Forum were the CEOs of Minnesota Public Radio and TPT, and then coming back with the publisher of the Star Tribune. So all of it's really about looking at this big civic issue about the evolution in information. So for instance, what you're doing right now as a podcaster is very important because it brings new voices into the discussion. How do people find that? How do they navigate through that? How do we navigate through this super complicated issue of what is truth? How do people in doing what you do support themselves while they bring information? I like the moment we're in on some levels because there's a reordering that's democratizing things, that you don't necessarily need a zillionaire to employ you to get access. But it also means that this fracturization means that you have to do more fact checking, you have to do others. So we just want to put those issues on the agenda.
Well, some people do fact checking, right?
Yeah, some do and some don't.
I think that was one of the kind of big questions I had coming out of the conference was, it is great that people like me can find a niche and serve a purpose, but at the same time, there's other people out there who sort of have real agendas, right?
Right.
And they're not so worried about telling the truth or doing any fact checking. And I guess that worries me. I wonder if it worries you about just how fractured we are and how do people get.
Yeah, there are a bunch of different pieces of it. Let me start with an optimist and then give what is a not optimistic part of it. So why did we wind up in Vietnam? Why did we make that incredibly tragic mistake? Well, in part because there was a bit of groupthink among media. We had 3 network TV stations and a daily newspaper in different towns and 2 magazines, Time and Newsweek. And all of those reporters hung out in the same places in Saigon and were fed the same perspective that was way off base by our government. And the country walked down the road with all of this without access to broader information. In this moment, you can't have that. And that's a good thing in part because you get different perspectives. The bad thing is you get different perspectives that are sometimes not grounded in fact, and there are agendas. Now, I actually have more media experience in philanthropy or politics.
Yeah.
So I've been a reporter for non-agenda news outlets, suburban newspapers, the Sun newspaper, the Star Tribune for a bunch of years. Later, I worked at internet broadcasting in the intersection of internet and TV, and worked in internet for NPR and PRI. All of those were news organizations that did not overtly have a perspective. I was also publisher of the Twin Cities Reader and Q Monthly, which we helped start. Those were perspective journal. The Twin Cities Reader, like its counterpart City Pages, was overtly more progressive. It was overtly alternative. You knew that when you picked it up. Q Monthly was a gay and lesbian publication, and you knew that it was not neutral on the issue of LGBTQ rights, right? And that's one thing to have an overt perspective, but it's another thing to be an operation that's intentionally trying to use your advocacy to slant information. There was something on TV, this slander piece about Minneapolis that I shouldn't call it a slander piece, I guess, but it was clearly about trying to trash the city. And to me, that wasn't solid journalism. They interviewed people who had, axes to grind and all of that. It's more about, that's advocacy. And that's not, to me, journalism. At the very least, people now need to know much more, where is someone coming from?
Yeah, and you've seen that a lot with, I think you're referring to the precarious state, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of people question like who the backers were and things like that. And but I am curious, where do you get your news from now?
Well, first off, I get my news in the same way I get my food. I have a very diverse diet, okay? So I do spend a lot of time with Minnesota Public Radio, TPT, Star Tribune, but also love hyper-local publications. My son actually started Southwest Voices and Downtown Voices. I like that sort of media. To get Southwest Journal used to be my complete go-to publication. I read a number of magazines. I read New Yorker cover to cover, Atlantic. I follow different folks. Heather Cox Richardson is somebody who I think is sort of a must-read, and Pod Save America is another one. I know what perspective they are coming from, and I know them to be substantive. And others may have a different perspective on that. But I spend an awful lot of time trying to continue to broaden my media diet. I'm watching less network TV news. And
is any social media in there?
Oh, yeah. I mean, social media... I was coming into politics just when things were happening. So I think I still have the qualification being the first mayor on Facebook and one of the first on Twitter. And so I've always done a lot of that. When Twitter changed over to X, somehow my account, which had like a couple 100,000, maybe it was 100,000 people, but it was a big account, somehow stopped getting any responses. I don't know what the heck happened there, but that pissed me off in a big way.
They broke some things.
Yeah. And So I spend much less time there. I've gone back to Facebook, oddly enough, which has wound up being a place I'm comfortable. I do a little bit of LinkedIn here and there, Instagram. I don't know. It's like a diet. You need to mix it up, you know?
Yeah.
And if you think about that and you compare that to the quote unquote good old days, I read the Star Tribune, I watch CCO TV, both things that I very much did, but that's not going to cut it anymore. You know, I know something I read a lot is I love Monocle magazine. I don't know if you've ever heard that, but it comes out of London. But it's really, you know, the John Lennon song, "Imagine There's No Country."
Uh-huh.
It's kind of that in that it's very city oriented. And there's a good idea in Melbourne or in Helsinki or in whatever. You're kind of like a citizen of the world, and I'm trying to think more like that now. So just through the lens of cities, I read that.
Yeah. Well, so...
Archaeology magazine is one I read. Minnesota Gardener. Okay, I'll stop now.
So I was reading a little bit of your book, Pothole Confidential, and you know, I thought it was interesting. One of the things you talked about in the afterwards is, you know, kind of the rock falling downhill, and you're hoping that it just stays there for the next people to keep it from going further. Are there any sort of topics like that? I mean, you mentioned the achievement gap was kind of the same when you left as when you started, that you feel like this city still has a lot of work to do on?
Oh yeah, I've done civic work all my life. I considered my journalism part of that. I considered working at the downtown council part of it, or running Generation Next, which was a collaborative on education equity. What I do at the foundation is civic. So I never thought, okay, I'm going to be mayor and then that work is over. So that was one way that I expressed my commitment to the community. So, education equity to me was the single biggest issue that was facing us at the time. And that's why I was really happy to spend 2 years at Generation Next just focused on that. And we made a little bit of progress, and there's a ton more to do. And right now I'm very focused on economic inequities. And so there's a really great initiative that brought together philanthropy and government and the lending institutions called GroundBreak. And we're now working on two main outcomes: increasing homeownership and business starts for Black residents as an example of going to the biggest gap, and then being able to apply that to others who aren't benefiting as much from the economy. And but the biggest thing I always want to work on is career pathways for kids of color. And I got that in part because I grew up in a period of time where I was in circumstances where I was able to understand at a pretty early age what kind of privilege I had as a white kid. And I want to always work on that. My dad had a drugstore right around here, first at 26th and 4th, which was torn down for the freeway, and then at Chicago and Franklin. And so growing up, I was on a scholarship at Breck. So I grew up in a middle-class neighborhood. I went to school with people primarily much richer than me. And then we'd go down to the drugstore after school, and I'd see people primarily much poorer than I was. And so I was pretty immersed pretty early in what I would now call the continuum of privilege. So if you ask me, like, what are the things I work on, it's trying to move toward a society where we actually don't have these huge gaps. And
I was just reading someone today who refers to it as like the luxury boxification of America, like just talking about how when they used to go to the Twins game, you know, the highest price seats and the lowest
Yeah.
price seats weren't that.
I read this exact, who wrote it? Because I read that like
Yeah.
yesterday or today.
Yeah.
But it was a really good discussion.
It was about it was about a philosopher that I think that came from
There we go. Right.
Minneapolis. And
Yeah. So
just won $1 million
I grew up in
prize. Yeah.
I grew up in that period of time, and my brother and I would take the bus out to Met Stadium. We'd hang out there, and there were kids' tickets, and there weren't the luxury boxes. He made a really good point. What you also have to add on to that is during that period of time, women didn't have equality, Native people didn't, Black people didn't. This city was still in the last stages of being one of the more anti-Semitic communities. So I totally got his point that sports arenas economics are now based on getting larger amounts for those with the most amount of money, and they get more access. I get that. But I don't think it's as simple as saying those were good days or bad days. The tax rate on those at the top level was higher back then, and that meant that we didn't have the same scarcity mentality on issues like education and investing in public works and that sort of thing. But it wasn't fully the good old days.
One of the interesting things I always find in reading articles about like that, or like the letters, the responses, the comments, and one of the comments, so his point was about, we need to start doing things more as a community. So, like basically the rich
Right.
people and poor people need to mix more and stuff
Right.
like that. But one of the comments that I thought was pretty accurate, and I think it feeds into this talk about the media, was this: it's easy to kind of say we should be tolerant of others and welcome their ideas, but it does get much more difficult when people aren't working from the same reality, right?
Well, completely.
Which,
yeah.
when like you were saying earlier, there was two magazines, 3 TV stations. Now there's hundreds of choices, and a lot of people in their families and their friends have someone that just kind of goes down this hole on YouTube or wherever, and they're just living by a completely different set of facts. That worries me about the media, and like, how do you come back from that where you can start kind of talking about shared values when some people really have different worldviews completely?
Well, you're putting your finger on a hugely important issue, and a large part of that is about information. Where do we get our information? What is a common set of facts that we can agree on? That's a massive issue right now. There is something else going on that gives me a little more hope and makes me feel a little more optimistic about this community. And I'll trace it back to, at a certain point when I was mayor, I got an invitation to go to Sweden because they wanted to understand why Somalis were doing better here than there. And lots of challenges for Somali communities, especially back then. But still, they had huge unemployment and almost no entrepreneurship in Sweden, and they wanted to figure it out. We have about the same amount of Somali residents. So I said, okay, great. So I went over there, and I'm walking around downtown Stockholm before the meeting started, and I'm thinking, like, where are the Somali people? Because they supposedly have this huge population. And it was 100% Anglo people in the middle of Stockholm. And I said, so take me to where the Somalis are. So we get in a car and we drive out to these far ex-urban places that were really nice. There's really good public housing, they had good education and all of that. My knowledge was that they were pretty good public support financially for them. But here's some money, here's now nice housing, go far away from us. Mm-hmm. So I put this into the context of how we relate to other people, because contrast that with what you see here. Go to one of the most beautiful spots in Minneapolis, B'nai Makaska at sunset. Walk around that, and because the people who settled this, the white settlers who started the city, did preserve the best places for everyone. So you go around B'nai Makaska at sunset, and there are a lot of different cultures around that. And so that's a long way of saying the best way for you to understand somebody different than you is to share common ground. And I would say that we have common ground in this town, not always common purpose. In Sweden, I think there's a common purpose, but not a common ground. And it's easier to draw a cartoon if you never see someone, never talk to them, never work with them, never go to school with them. And I've spoken at a few high school graduations. I remember doing this at Eden Prairie High School and Stillwater High School. It got a weird reaction, but I was there when I was working on education equity, and I started talking to them about there are some students who graduate from high school with a deficit, and they haven't had the same exposure to information. I was going on and talking about it in language that is often applied to an inner city school. Mm-hmm. And I said, that's why those of you who are in a school with primarily people who look exactly like you and are from the same culture are starting with a deficit. The kids coming out of Minneapolis high schools are exposed to people who speak 100 different languages, come from different parts of the globe. Your ability as a kid coming out of Minneapolis public schools to navigate a complex world is greater than somebody who was in a more isolated experience. And during doing all that work, I also was privy to different research about social emotional development of kids. And while all the sort of rigid metrics about math and reading scores are hideous along racial lines, huge gaps, when you get into positive or commitment to learning, it jumbles it up, and there are communities of color that are above where white students are at. And so you get a very different, more nuanced picture. But the bottom line to me is the single best way we can learn from each other is to be around people who aren't exactly like us. And that's harder and harder these days. But this community, Minneapolis, has a lot of common ground physically.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned, Dame Mikasa Ska, because that they had to close the parking lot this summer, right? There was a couple of different parks where they had like some real violence. They had to shut them down. And I remember when you were mayor, I think there was a horrific shooting above, I think, a glass facility or some kind of manufacturing facility or sign
accent printing.
And so, I mean, one of the reasons I kind of wanted, and I know at the time you had a big conference on gun violence and stuff, and I'd really like to get your perspective on, what has kind of changed over the last 15 years here in Minneapolis.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned, are relations with the Somali community better? Are we making progress on things like gun violence? Because certainly, I mean, some of the high-profile things that have happened recently just make me wonder, has anything changed since that event?
Well, we have some real issues, but let's separate things. We were talking about diversity and understanding people different, so let's put a line there and go into because there's a very big difference. Accent printing had nothing to do with racial interest or not. There was a disgruntled employee with mental health issues who came in and slaughtered people in a hideous, hideous incident. It wasn't a racial incident. But on the issue of guns and violence, I spent an awful lot of time out on street corners in the middle of the night when there was a shooting. Mm-hmm. And the inability of people in positions of authority to act on that is beyond my words to express how upset I am. We know that when we banned assault weapons, murders went down. We also know that when someone walks into a school or a church with a military weapon, it's not even a gun, it has nothing to do with hunting, it has to do with slaughtering people in war. We know that if that was a traditional gun, it could fire a bullet and kill someone. And we know if it's an assault weapon, it can fire scores of bullets and kill scores of people. My God, the baseline should be, let's kill fewer people. The idea that we will tolerate anybody being killed is intolerable to me. And the idea that time and time and time again, we march up to this point, and there are people standing in the way of it, primarily in the Republican Party. Used to be a lot of Democrats were part of that too. I think more and more they've gotten more clear about this. But regardless of what party you're from, the fact that right now we can't call a special session and do something, and I've been down this road before, and I want to throw up my hands and say there's nothing we can do, but I don't feel I have the privilege to do that, and I don't feel anyone has the privilege to just say, well, nothing ever happens, I'm not going to do anything. Get the hell off the mat, pick yourself up, recognize the hideous situation we're in, and everybody has to do more to ban guns. I remember one incident in North Minneapolis where there were a kid killed a kid. And I learned in all the work I did on Mayors Against Illegal Handguns and all this other work that the first question you should ask is, where did the gun come from? And, you know, the issue of who is supplying our kids with guns is one of many, many that I'd like to unpack. I could go on about this, but you know,
I mean, obviously there's the big manufacturers there that play a big part in the economy in the U.S. and I found it interesting, and I've heard that like people come in from Chicago and sell them here in the city. I don't know if that's true or not. But like
people from Chicago always get blamed for doing anything. Anything that bad happens in Minneapolis is somebody coming in from Chicago.
But I find it interesting. Like I have a friend who lives in California and one who lives in North Carolina, and they both went to buy handguns, and their experiences were absolutely completely different.
Interesting.
Like in California, he had to go through training. He had to wait. There was a period.
Yeah.
Yeah. My friend in North Carolina, in and out in 15 minutes, and he told the guy, I don't know how to use a gun, and he told him to go look on YouTube.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
right.
So, but I'm sort of at that point where I feel like we're just never getting rid of them. There's too many, and
when that happens, then we know we won't. And I totally get the emotion you have, and I assume anybody listening to this thing has the same feeling, my God, this is never going to happen. But I just counsel all of us, when that thought comes into your head, and it comes into mine all the time, we can't accept that.
Yeah.
And what does that mean? I don't know. Can I tell you one thing that worked very well, which is during the period of like 2005, 6, and 7, there was this huge escalation of violence in the city. And we really dug down to try to figure out what the heck is going on here. And it was very much about youth and youth violence and youth killing other youth. And so we brought in all these different people who had done a lot of work on that and wound up putting together something called the Youth Violence Prevention Initiative. And it was based on a lot of good research and that, and basically took 4 key values: every young person surrounded by a trusted adult, intervene at the first sign of at-risk behavior, rejuvenate, and then attack the culture of violence. We had all 4 of those things. So for instance, every young person surrounded by a trusted adult was to understand all the different mentoring programs, all of that. Intervening at the first sign of at-risk behavior, we then asked the question, what is the first sign that a kid is beginning to move down the wrong? So curfew and truancy were critical, so we set up a curfew truancy center and worked to mitigate it. And so you walk through it all, but there were, I think, like 40 elements to it. But the community, the city, the county, philanthropy, community groups all got together and drilled down on this plan. And over the next few years, we drove crime down in a significant way, especially youth violence. And this fallacy that somehow all you have to do is put a cop on the street. Cops are really important. And the cops who are building relationships are dramatically more important, but they're not enough. And there are all sorts of people doing upstream mitigation, but what we did at that time was tie them together, not let so many kids fall through the cracks, and it works. And so when people, like, for instance, we have an election going on, they're talking about crime and this and that, great, cops, I get it. And what is your plan to bring back things that have worked, be it that youth violence prevention plan or your own, that recognize police are one part of the problem, but we can't put it all on their shoulders, nor can we expect that every issue can be solved with force.
Right.
Sorry, I'm off on a...
No, that's good. I mean, that's very relevant to what's going on right now. And it reminded me a little bit about a conversation I had with Mark Andrew where we were talking about the role of the county versus the city.
Yeah.
And other guests I've had on here talking about some of those violence prevention programs and how do you kind of address it when people just make snap decisions and get them. Do you feel like the city is doing the right amount, or maybe the county needs to do more, or is there a good mix? And it kind of made me think too, and one of the things you said in your book that I liked was that there's lots of people out there doing good things. What's often missing is alignment.
Yeah.
Where are we at, do you think, with getting alignment between some of these programs that have been around for 20 years in the county and the city? Because it certainly doesn't seem like we're always using resources efficiently, and there's overlap and things are kind of...
Well, this community was set up by people who distrusted concentration of power. And so I would add, it's also not a city that starts politics and politicians rarely start solutions here. It's usually civic leaders. So I say all that as a backdrop to the fact that it's not surprising that a community thinking the way we do, which is much more inclusive, but it's also much more difficult to get everybody moving in a straight line. But I do think, to start with, I think we have the best police chief I know that we've had. And I was way back. I was a crime reporter. I, tried different types of chiefs. Tim Dolan, I thought was a good chief when I was mayor. But I think right now we've got a really good chief.
What about it? What about him do you like?
Well, several things. I think he fully understands when it is necessary to have tough enforcement, but I've also spent enough time trying to understand the way he looks at things, the world, community, and others, to know that he has a very inclusive view of that and recognizes that there are certain things police can do, and we need to train them, and we need to remove those who aren't qualified, and we need to recruit the others. I think he has the right mix. Not everybody would agree. My experience in dealing with lots of chiefs is we got a really good one. I think the promise of the Department of Public Safety was a really smart one, which is to say, don't put it all on the chief, bring in these other parts of it. I think the jury's kind of still out on how that would be tied together. I don't know if the city-county thing is working as well right now as it should, and you said you had Mark Andrew on, and he did a very good job and had a very expansive view of what the county should do. The county represents something like 1 out of every 5 residents of the state, and it also has the most, it's a very strong tax base and all that. So the county, if deployed right, if unified, if partnering with others, can do a lot. And county government and city government are viewed very differently by people. They understand city government is very proximate on it. I would say the vast majority of people don't know who their county commissioner is.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually one of the gaps I feel like is existing in our media universe right now. Like anything happens and people know who to call at the city, and it seems like there's never any coverage of what happens at a county commission board or their budget or any of those things just go uncovered, and I think that, and one of the things that was the person from the Sahan Journal said that I thought made a lot of sense was, you had the reporting down here on one end, and when you have good reporting, it ends up down here turning into like good legislation. Right?
Yeah.
And I think that's true, but I think when you don't have the reporting, then whatever kind of legislation you get can be a real crapshoot.
Yeah, and there are some really good people on the county board, some really smart people there who, but they're not seen. Now, I happen to support what the Star Tribune did, which is to broaden into more statewide coverage, because I do think with urban-rural divides and all of that, it's very helpful for those of us who live in the metro area to understand the issues in other places. I want to be part of a Minnesota, so people would come to me after that, aren't you mad about it not being the Minneapolis Star Tribune? No, I used to work there. I'm all about Minneapolis, but I think it's great that it does that. But the consequence is the coverage is not as much. It was never that deep in the city, but it's really not anywhere nearly what it was in the county, where there's so much more money spent and really critical issues, especially in connecting human services. If I was in a newsroom, and I don't think I'd be a great assignment editor, but I would probably try to do much more coverage that was centered on an individual and then back out, as opposed to I cover crime, I cover housing, et cetera. I say that because if you take an encampment, for instance, and take someone in that encampment, what are the 6 different levers that need to be moved to have that person in a better space? Mm-hmm. And one initiative we have that I'd love to see us bring back is something called Project Homeless Connect, which was recognize the intersection of needs. If you put a person in the center as opposed to a service, you can solve things. So for instance, the whole convention center was opened up, and there was a survey about how many homeless people do we have, and let's pretend the number was 1,000. Then there were 1,000 volunteers, primarily from faith communities. And then there were services, a whole range of things homeless people need. Housing, obviously, employment, healthcare, dental work, haircut, legal advice, all of that. And so you meet your volunteer, you meet your client, that's the homeless person. You do an intake thing, figure out what the needs are. Then you walk that person around the convention center and got them the services they need. That's how you can really unify services and put the individual at the center. Mm-hmm. And in doing so, you also reinvent the bureaucracy. So for instance, when the tornado hit North Minneapolis, there was teachers were saying, oh my gosh, this kid is totally acting out. I don't know why that's there. So the county put a service worker in each school, meaning instead of the teacher needing to figure out what's wrong with that kid in my class, the county person had access to information that, they suddenly became homeless because the tornado hit their home. Their parents are facing this issue or that. And so you could take a holistic look at that student instead of just the teacher putting the kid on detention or worse, expelling them. Mm-hmm. They could take that holistic. So putting an individual at the center of delivering services, it is much harder to do than for me to say, but it is a key to when you really are consuming a political leader. Listen to the way they describe those things, and if you begin to hear them putting a person at the center, you understand that they'll probably be better at navigating the intersections in public policy that lead to policies that are humane. Yeah.
Well, I wrote, one of my newsletters talked about how much money the county is spending per homeless individual, and it's something like $90,000.
It's a huge number, yeah.
And I think, just thinking about your alignment and what you're talking about, like walking around and getting them all the different services, I feel like if we had some sort of better alignment and efficiency, the money is actually there to take care of the problem. It's just frustrating that it seems like we don't have the alignment and things continue. I mean, I know it's not that simple. Some people have obviously mental health issues and drug addiction issues and stuff that maybe they would never show up at the conference center to get services.
Right, and there were definitely people like that. I'm not going to agree off the top that we would have enough money, only because I learned enough in government to know that, especially I had to navigate through some pretty big budget crises, so we may not, but I can guarantee it would be much more efficient. That's for darn sure. And it's one of the things too, and it's not just about government, but any kind of business. If you're trying to reinvent the way you do something, a lot of times you're going to save money, but very rarely do you save money in the first year. Mm-hmm. Almost always when you're pivoting from one thing to another, you have to make a one-time investment to lead to long-term gains, or savings, I should say. And that's a little complicated when you're trying to do that in a challenged budget period, which, by the way, now the city and the county are in because office valuations are crashing and all that kind of thing. So that's why I'll often talk about philanthropy's role. Philanthropy's money is dwarfed by what's in government. Philanthropy can't, for instance, step in and replace all the cuts that Trump has made. But I say that philanthropy is, or government is a gas station, philanthropy is Jiffy Lube. You go to the gas station regularly. You go to Jiffy Lube every once in a while, make it work better. So if you go back to that point I was making about one-time expenses to save money long-term, that may be a place sometimes for philanthropy to step in. Philanthropy can't hire a person for government, because unless they're guaranteeing they're going to pay their salary ongoing, but they can do the retraining for a worker to make them better able to do that. So, I think that's some of the stuff we'll have to start thinking about.
So, and I don't want to keep you too long. I know you have a lot going on today, but I did want to talk about the city and the election. I noticed in your book, and I'm not sure the year, but the budget you were handling was like 1.4 billion, I think, and now the city's up to almost 2 billion, and like the county is at 2 or more, I think. But do you have any thoughts on with this coming election, who has the most chance of success of managing that budget and allocating it well? And one of the things I feel like we don't have enough discussion of is, you talked about business at one point, and how do we get the downtown coming back and small businesses in our communities? I feel like there's a lot of big ideas that get thrown around in the election cycle, right? Everyone's promising things, but I have a hard time figuring out who's going to get the nuts and bolts in place to strengthen the economy and provide jobs for people and stuff. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, there were a few questions in there. Let me try to parse out. Well, I mean, they're all good, but let me try to. Just sort of a context setting. I made a decision a few years ago that instead of endorsing in city races or saying this person is better or that, I definitely have opinions, obviously, but I never, especially when I was running and had never been in office, I needed safe places to go where I could be super confidential. So I've said to anybody running, I'll give you whatever information you want. I'll give you advice if you want. It will be 100% confidential, and that's open to anybody. So set that over here.
And have people come to you?
Yeah. And I don't kiss and tell, if you will. What I do is, and it's been really wonderful because I hope it's been helpful to some people, but it's been very helpful to me to really understand this issue of the divide in the city right now. And it is so much worse in the way they tend to show up at City Hall than in the way when you really get people aside and talk about. There is not a huge divide in it. There are huge overt forces that are polarizing people. If I could wave a magic wand, I would eliminate all independent expenditures in city elections, because we have two big groups that are independent expenditures trashing the other quote unquote side. Yeah. And that is polarizing, and it is also creating a dynamic where one group of people that wins will have a hell of a lot of difficulty getting the others who won from the quote unquote other side, because they were trashing each other for a few months. There's going to be a lot of anxiety. I personally am going to vote for whoever I think is trying to bring the city together. And everybody has the possibility of doing that. And so a lot of people my age, which is not as young as I used to be, are very upset about democratic socialists. And a lot of democratic socialists are very upset about old people who won't get out of the way. And I think those are both kind of fairly legitimate, but also kind of diminishing about the fact of the matter is, when I talk to people from these two different groups that are supposed to be so far apart, I see a lot of ways they can work together. And I think that breakdown in City Hall right now is something the rest of us should be trying to solve. Not having huge amounts of independent money coming in saying, oh, that group of people is horrible and that group is horrible. Even if someone is 99% in disagreement with you, figure out the 1%. It's not easy, but there's something there. I would put Trump in a whole different category because of the lawlessness, and all of that. That's a whole other category.
Yeah.
But within the quote unquote divide in the city, that is a solvable divide. And it should be up to the citizens of Minneapolis to say, if the political leaders won't do it, we're going to vote for whoever talks about bringing the city together. And that's where I'm at. Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, I would say like all of the, at least mayoral candidates kind of talk about that a little bit. Like they all sort of have said they can bring the city together and
prove it.
Yeah, I mean,
and they
that's
can.
the hard thing.
I know all of them, and I think each one of them could. But if you aren't talking that way in the election, if you aren't showing that in the election, it's going to be harder when you get in there. And if all you do in the election is trash the other person, then good luck getting something done.
Yeah, I mean, I have that concern when it comes to like the city council and the mayor. I mean, because some of the city council candidates have said terrible things about Fry. So if he ends up winning and they end up winning, then what happens for the city?
Right.
Next year.
And and it's a different moment. I know that in my moment, I was super proud of the fact that every council member who served with me voted with me on a big issue and voted against me on a big issue. There's one council member who pretty much defined himself as being, I'm not RT, and voted against a bunch of stuff. But I wound up working with him on a couple of really big things. That was really rewarding. There was intersection. I understand this is a different moment. It is not the same. But I would so love to see that, about a vote that shuffled the blocks that, this is not a good thing right now. And what's really frustrating is there are really good people within that who I know, on some of them at least, on a deeper level than whatever label is on their forehead. Yeah.
Well, and I do think, so obviously the independent expenditure committees ramp things up, but there is a place for media and social media here too that kind of feeds on that. And I was recently, maybe it was at the conference, someone was saying this made sense to me, like, when the plane lands smoothly, no one covers it. It's not news, right? Yeah. It's the crash, and I feel like it's the conflicts that get covered mostly. Yeah. And that contributes to the divide. So, well, as we close things out, is there any advice that you would give to getting, that would help us get through this election smoothly, you think, and be able to work together on the other side? I mean, you mentioned candidates need to be talking about how they're bringing the city together, but any other ideas?
Well, this isn't directly addressing. The thing that is going through my mind is for people to calm down a little bit and recognize that right now we have a common enemy, and that isn't a political statement. That's about the fact that we happen to have a person in the White House who is targeting cities.
Yeah.
And targeting what a city should be, which is a place where everybody belongs. And that is a common value. So I believe we need to find a way to recognize what brings us together. I think there's a hangover from the hideousness around George Floyd's murder, where when the whole world was looking at us, some people reacted one way, some reacted another. Well, get over it, you know. And that's an easy thing to say, but I think it's also a necessary thing to say. I also think just one other thing is, well, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I mean, some people are definitely not it seems like that issue in particular is holding up some things, and I think of George Floyd Square, right? Like,
right.
And these, I do wonder, how do we get on more common ground so that we can make a decision? You know, it's like 5 years on, and everything's still in limbo, and people are not letting go, and it definitely does seem like at times they don't want to let go because this is sort of a way to, I don't know, attack the other side and get votes or something.
Having not been in the middle of the discussions of George Floyd Square, I don't know enough to comment on that one, other than it's just ungodly frustrating. But what I was referring to was more when some city council members stood up behind a sign that said defund the police. That was turned into a national cartoon. What some of them were saying, in my mind, was similar to what I was just saying about youth violence prevention, which is enforcement is important, but we also have to move resources upstream. Mm-hmm. That is a legitimate point. The cartoon that was made out of it, and I think probably a bad judgment in standing in front of a sign or adopting a slogan that simplified into a cartoonish way, put a label on a group of people. I would also say the people who looked at that moment when the entire world was looking at us for racial equity and didn't do much, they also hold some responsibility. Both of those things are in the past. They're part of our past, you know, forgive but don't forget. But we've got, look out at what is, you know, look at Portland, look at Chicago, look at what could and probably will happen to this city. If we're in this big, you know, rip each other apart moment, this happens to be one of the great cities in America, and it's a great city because people from a huge part of the center of the country, when they didn't feel welcome in their small town, because they were gay, because they had a viewpoint that was different of this, we said, come on to Minneapolis. Mm-hmm. And when people from around the world were really facing problems, we said, come to Minneapolis. And this city is so much better because of that. And revel in that. You know, we are living the values of the Statue of Liberty at a moment when the country's leaders are not. So lock arms and stand up and defend who we are without what I consider to be increasingly petty interpersonal conversations mm-hmm. that have history that you just have to get over. And I'm so proud of the fact that when I left office, I made a list of people I considered political enemies. Okay. And I am down to about 2. I've swallowed hard to figure out ways to patch it up with a lot of people, and it's the most liberating thing. I'm not perfect. I have some that I can't quite get over, but God, it's liberating to get that off your shoulders. That's true in any case, but it is urgently needed right now in politics, and it's urgently needed in Minneapolis.
Yeah, I agree, and I feel like the heat is rising as we get closer to Election Day, and I really hope it doesn't get to the point where so many people are burned that the city can't function well. I don't know. We'll see. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. Really interesting conversation, and good luck with the Minneapolis Foundation and all the good civic work you do.
Thank you.
So, all right.
Good luck to you.
Thanks.